noise of the world behind. Night rested quietly over the hills surrounding Jerusalem. The final lanterns still glowed behind narrow stone windows, while cool desert wind moved softly through olive trees beside the roads leading toward Jericho. Far beyond the city walls, scattered travelers continued their journeys beneath the stars, carrying burdens, memories, worries, and prayers through the valleys of Judea. It was a world shaped by roads traveled by merchants, by shepherds, by Roman soldiers, by pilgrims searching for God, by lonely people carrying silent pain no one else could see. And perhaps human hearts have not changed very much since those days. People still carry invisible wounds, still walk through crowded places while feeling alone, still hope someone might notice the heaviness hidden behind ordinary faces. There are many kinds of suffering. Some wounds bleed openly. Others remain hidden beneath smiles, responsibilities, distractions, and routine. There are people surrounded by others who still feel unseen. People exhausted emotionally while pretending everything is fine. People quietly lying beside the road of life, hoping someone will stop long enough to care. Yet the world moves quickly. People hurry toward obligations, toward ambitions, toward noise. And many become so consumed by their own struggles that they stop noticing the suffering resting beside them. Perhaps that is why genuine compassion feels so rare. Because true mercy interrupts life. It interrupts comfort, interrupts schedules, interrupts emotional distance. Many people are willing to feel sympathy. Far fewer are willing to carry another person's burden. Tonight's story begins upon the dangerous road between Jerusalem and Jericho. A road surrounded by barren cliffs and dry valleys where thieves often hid among the rocks waiting for isolated travelers. Yet perhaps the greatest danger upon that road was not violence itself. Perhaps the deeper danger was indifference. Because wounds caused by cruelty sometimes heal with time. But wounds caused by abandonment often remain much longer inside the soul. Above Jerusalem, the temple still stood illuminated beneath torchlight, while priests prepared for morning prayers and merchants rested before another day of trade and movement. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet somewhere beyond the city gates, suffering already waited silently beside the road. A traveler was preparing for a journey he believed would be ordinary. He did not yet know that before the next sunset, his life would depend entirely upon the mercy of strangers. Nor did he know that the man who would eventually save him would come from the very people many around him had learned to distrust. The stars stretched endlessly above Judea, while cool wind moved softly through the sleeping valleys. And beneath those silent heavens, another truth quietly remained alive. Every day, human beings pass opportunities for mercy. Some notice them, some avoid them, some never slow down enough to see them at all. Perhaps that is why stories like this survive for thousands of years. Because beneath the ancient roads, the stone cities, and the desert night, the story speaks about something timeless: the human need for compassion, and the frightening possibility that many people walk past suffering every single day without truly seeing it. The road descending from Jerusalem toward Jericho was feared by many travelers. It wound through barren valleys and narrow cliffs where thieves often hid among the rocks, waiting silently for isolated strangers carrying silver, grain, or trade goods between the cities. Yet despite the danger, the road remained busy. Merchants crossed it daily. Pilgrims traveled toward Jerusalem. Roman soldiers marched through the valleys beneath heavy armor. Life continued moving, as it always does. That morning, sunlight slowly spread across the hills of Judea, while cool wind carried the distant sound of shepherd bells through the valleys. Jerusalem awakened behind the traveler as he began descending the ancient road. The temple still glowed softly beneath early morning light. Marketplaces slowly filled with movement. Voices echoed through narrow streets. The traveler walked calmly. He was neither rich nor poor, simply an ordinary man carrying responsibilities like countless others around him. And like many people, he believed he understood how the day would unfold. A simple journey. Trade. Return home. Nothing more. Yet hidden danger often waits most quietly during ordinary days. Far above the road, unseen eyes already watched him from among the rocks. Before leaving Jerusalem, the traveler spent several quiet moments beside his sleeping family. His wife prepared bread carefully for the journey, while weak lantern light moved softly across the walls of their small stone home. "Return safely," she whispered. The traveler smiled gently. "I will." The answer felt certain. People rarely recognize which ordinary moments will become their final memories of peace. Before leaving, the traveler paused beside the doorway and lifted his eyes toward heaven. "Lord," he prayed softly, "guide my steps today." Then he stepped into the cool morning air. The city slowly awakened around him. Merchants carried baskets through crowded streets. Children ran beside market stalls. Priests prepared for morning prayers within the temple courts. Everything felt familiar, safe, predictable. Yet somewhere ahead upon the Jericho road, his life was already beginning to change. The attack came suddenly. One moment the traveler walked peacefully through the valley. The next moment figures emerged violently from behind the rocks. Hands grabbed him. Shouting filled the air. Dust rose violently beneath struggling feet. The traveler fought desperately, but the thieves overwhelmed him quickly. They struck him repeatedly before stealing his supplies, money, and clothing. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished back among the cliffs. Silence returned. Terrible silence. The traveler lay wounded beside the road beneath the burning Judean sun. Blood stained the dry earth. His breathing became weak and uneven. And for the first time in his life, he understood how fragile human existence truly is. Hours passed slowly. The wounded traveler drifted weakly between pain and exhaustion while heat shimmered across the rocks surrounding the valley. At times he heard footsteps approaching. Hope rose inside him instantly. Yet each time, the sounds faded away. The traveler thought about home, his wife, his children, the ordinary peace he had taken for granted only that morning. Tears mixed quietly with dust upon his face. Then at last, another figure appeared upon the road, a priest. Relief flooded through the wounded man immediately. Surely this man would stop. Surely a servant of God would not ignore suffering. The priest approached closer. Their eyes met briefly. Then quietly, the priest crossed toward the opposite side of the road and continued walking. The traveler watched him disappear into the distance, and suddenly the loneliness felt heavier than the wounds themselves. The priest had seen the wounded man clearly. For a brief moment, compassion stirred within him. Yet almost immediately, another voice rose inside his thoughts. Danger, responsibility, delay. What if thieves still remained nearby? What if stopping interrupted important duties? So the priest continued walking. At first, he convinced himself the decision was practical, reasonable, necessary. Yet the wounded man's face remained inside his mind long after the valley disappeared behind him, because people can often escape difficult situations physically, while remaining emotionally haunted by them afterward. Not long afterward, another traveler approached the wounded man, a Levite. Unlike the priest, he slowed beside the injured traveler and looked carefully at him. The suffering disturbed him deeply. The traveler's face was pale beneath the dust. Blood darkened the stones beneath his body. His breathing sounded shallow and uneven. For a brief moment, the Levite felt genuine pity. He imagined the pain, the fear, the loneliness of lying abandoned beside the road while strangers passed without helping. Yet alongside compassion came another feeling, fear. The road remained dangerous near sunset. The thieves could still be nearby. Stopping might place him in danger as well. The Levite stood silently beside the wounded man while conflict unfolded inside his heart. Part of him wanted to help. Another part wanted to leave quickly and protect himself. And perhaps many people know this same internal struggle. The uncomfortable moment when compassion asks something costly. Time, energy, risk, emotional involvement. The wounded traveler lifted his eyes weakly toward him. For a moment, hope returned once again. The Levite hesitated. Then slowly, he stepped backward. The traveler's expression changed immediately. Not anger, something sadder. Recognition. Another person had chosen safety instead of mercy. The Levite lowered his eyes and continued walking down the road. At first he moved quickly, trying to escape the discomfort rising inside him. Yet the further he traveled, the less peaceful he felt. Because compassion ignored rarely disappears quietly from the conscience. Long after the wounded man vanished behind the cliffs, the memory continued following him through the valleys of Judea. And somewhere behind him, beside the lonely road, a suffering man remained abandoned beneath the darkening sky. Evening slowly approached across the hills of Judea. Long shadows stretched across the road while cold wind gradually replaced the burning heat of the day. The wounded traveler drifted weakly between exhaustion and despair. His body ached constantly. His lips had become dry from thirst. Pain moved through him with every breath. Yet deeper than physical suffering was another feeling slowly growing inside him. Abandonment. People had seen him and still continued walking. There is a particular kind of loneliness created not by physical isolation alone, but by realizing others have witnessed your suffering and chosen not to stop. The traveler stared weakly toward the empty road. His thoughts drifted toward home again. He imagined his wife waiting for his return, his children laughing beside the evening fire. The small, peaceful moments he once considered ordinary. Now those memories felt unbearably precious. Tears mixed quietly with dust upon his face. The sky above Judea slowly darkened into deep gold and red while distant birds circled above the cliffs. The traveler whispered weakly, "Lord, do prayer disappeared softly into the wind. Silence returned. The valleys around him grew darker. For a long time, nothing moved except the cold desert air sweeping through the rocks. Then finally, far in the distance, another figure appeared upon the road. The traveler could barely focus his eyes now. At first, the approaching figure looked only like a shadow moving slowly beneath the fading sunset. But gradually the traveler understood. Another traveler, another stranger, another chance for mercy. And somewhere deep inside his exhausted soul, hope rose once more. The approaching traveler rode quietly beneath the evening sky. A Samaritan. In those days, many Jews distrusted Samaritans deeply. Old divisions separated their peoples through generations of bitterness, pride, and suspicion. The wounded traveler himself, had circumstances been different, might never have willingly spoken with such a man. Yet suffering changes human perspective. The Samaritan noticed the injured figure beside the road from far away. At first, he slowed cautiously. The road remained dangerous after sunset. Stopping carried real risk. The Samaritan studied the empty cliffs surrounding the valley carefully. The wind moved softly through the rocks. The road remained silent. Then his eyes returned to the wounded traveler. Blood, pain, loneliness, and suddenly something inside him became impossible to ignore. Compassion, not shallow pity, not distant sympathy, something deeper. The kind of compassion that interrupts a person's journey completely. The Samaritan climbed slowly from his animal and approached carefully. The wounded traveler stared upward weakly. A stranger had stopped. Not the priest, not the Levite, a Samaritan. The traveler could barely understand it. The Samaritan knelt beside him quietly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Only the evening wind moved softly through the valley around them. Then finally the Samaritan asked gently, "Can you hear me?" The traveler nodded weakly. And in that quiet moment beside the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, everything began changing. Because sometimes mercy arrives from the place people least expect, and sometimes the people society teaches us to distrust become the very people who save us. The Samaritan knelt beside the wounded traveler carefully while the final light of sunset slowly faded across the hills of Judea. Up close, the injuries looked even worse. Bruises darkened the traveler's face. Blood covered his torn clothing. Dust clung to his skin beneath the cold evening wind. The Samaritan lowered his eyes quietly for a moment. He understood immediately that the man had been left there for many hours, perhaps longer. And perhaps what disturbed him most deeply was not only the violence itself, but the realization that others had already passed this road before him. Others had seen the suffering and continued walking. The Samaritan removed a small container of oil and wine from his supplies. Then gently, he began cleaning the traveler's wounds. The injured man cried out weakly as the wine touched broken skin. "I know," the Samaritan whispered softly. "Hold still." His voice carried calmness rather than fear. And slowly, for the first time since the attack, the traveler no longer felt completely alone. The Samaritan worked patiently, carefully, with the quiet focus of someone who understood that human pain deserved gentleness. The valley around them continued growing darker. Above the cliffs, the first stars slowly appeared. The Samaritan tore strips of cloth from his own garments and wrapped the traveler's wounds tightly to slow the bleeding. Then he offered water carefully. The wounded man drank slowly while trembling from exhaustion. For several moments, silence rested between them. Only wind moved through the valley. The traveler stared weakly at the Samaritan beside him. "You stopped," he whispered quietly. The Samaritan looked toward the dark road stretching ahead before answering. "Yes." The traveler struggled to understand. Earlier that same evening, holy men had passed him without helping. Yet this stranger remained beside him now in the cold darkness of the valley. Why? The Samaritan seemed to sense the question forming silently inside the wounded man's thoughts. "Pain should never be left alone," he said quietly. The sentence remained suspended gently in the night air. Simple words, yet they carried enormous weight. Because perhaps one of the deepest human fears is not suffering itself, but suffering without compassion. The Samaritan looked carefully toward the road ahead. "We must move," he said softly. "The night will become colder soon." Slowly and carefully, he lifted the wounded traveler onto his own animal. The process was painful. The traveler nearly collapsed several times while the Samaritan supported his weight patiently. At last, they managed to continue forward together. The Samaritan walked beside the animal while holding the traveler steady whenever rough stones shook the narrow path. The road toward Jericho stretched silently beneath the stars. Far away, faint lights from distant homes flickered through the darkness. The wounded traveler drifted weakly between exhaustion and awareness. At times, he thought he might lose consciousness completely. Yet each time he opened his eyes again, the Samaritan was still there, still walking beside him, still helping, still carrying another man's suffering as though it mattered deeply. And perhaps that was the moment something inside the traveler truly began changing. Not physically, spiritually. Because many people spend years believing the world is ruled only by selfishness, ambition, cruelty, and division. Until one unexpected act of mercy quietly restores their faith in humanity again. The cold wind moved softly through the valleys surrounding the Jericho road while the stars above Judea glowed brighter with every passing hour. And beneath that endless sky, two strangers continued walking slowly through the darkness together. One wounded, one carrying compassion strong enough to interrupt his entire journey. And perhaps somewhere deep within the silence of that ancient road, both men were beginning to understand something eternal. Mercy has the power to transform not only the person who receives it, but also the soul willing to give it. The journey through the night felt longer than either man expected. The road between Jerusalem and Jericho became colder after sunset, and strong desert wind moved constantly through the valleys, carrying dust softly across the narrow paths between the cliffs. The Samaritan walked beside his animal patiently while supporting the wounded traveler whenever uneven stones threatened to shake him loose. Neither man spoke very much. Exhaustion surrounded them both. Yet despite the silence, something deeply human slowly began forming between them. Trust. At times the traveler drifted weakly awake. Each time, he found the Samaritan still beside him, still carrying responsibility for another man's suffering, still refusing to abandon him. And perhaps compassion becomes most powerful not during dramatic moments, but during long, quiet hours when helping another person grows exhausting and inconvenient. The Samaritan himself was tired. His legs ached from the difficult road. Dust covered his clothing. The cold night air stung his skin, and yet he continued walking. Because genuine mercy does not disappear once kindness becomes uncomfortable. At one point, the traveler whispered weakly, "Why would you risk this for me?" The Samaritan remained silent for several moments before answering. "When pain is ignored long enough," he said softly, "people begin forgetting they belong to one another." The traveler listened quietly. The wind moved gently through the dark valleys around them. The Samaritan continued, speaking slowly. "Too many people learn how to protect themselves from the suffering of others." His voice carried sadness now. They stop looking closely. They stop listening deeply. They stop allowing another person's pain to reach their heart. The traveler lowered his eyes weakly because he realized something uncomfortable. Had their situations been reversed, would he himself have stopped for a wounded Samaritan? The question lingered painfully inside him. Perhaps suffering often reveals truths people avoid during ordinary life. The road stretched endlessly beneath the stars. Far above them, the heavens glowed with countless lights, while silence rested peacefully across the hills of Judea. And beneath that silent sky, the wounded traveler slowly began understanding something many people never fully learn. Mercy is not weakness. Mercy requires strength powerful enough to place another human being above comfort, fear, and pride. Eventually, faint lantern light appeared in the distance. The Samaritan looked ahead carefully. An inn near Jericho. At last, shelter waited nearby. The inn stood quietly beside the road beneath the cold desert night. Warm lantern light glowed through small windows, while distant voices drifted softly from within the stone building. To the wounded traveler, it looked almost unreal. After hours of pain, fear, and loneliness, the sight of warmth and safety felt like something from a dream. The Samaritan guided the animal carefully into the courtyard. Almost immediately, the innkeeper stepped outside carrying a lantern. His expression changed instantly when he saw the injured man. "What happened?" he asked quickly. "Thieves," the Samaritan answered. Together they carefully lifted the traveler down and carried him inside. Warm air surrounded him immediately. The smell of bread and burning wood filled the room softly, while firelight flickered against stone walls darkened by years of smoke and travelers' stories. For the first time since the attack, the wounded traveler no longer felt exposed to the endless emptiness of the road. The innkeeper prepared warm water while the Samaritan remained beside the traveler, helping clean the wounds more carefully beneath the lantern light. The room itself felt peaceful. Outside, cold wind still moved through the valleys surrounding Jericho. But inside the small inn, warmth and mercy created a different world entirely. A safer world. The traveler watched the Samaritan quietly while exhaustion slowly overtook him again. He still struggled to understand why this stranger had chosen to help him so completely. Most people protected themselves first. Most people avoided inconvenience, avoided danger, avoided emotional involvement. Yet this man had interrupted his entire journey for someone he did not even know. The Samaritan noticed the traveler watching him. "You should rest," he said gently. The traveler hesitated before speaking. "Why didn't you leave me there like the others?" The question lingered quietly between them. For a long moment, only the sound of firewood cracking beside the hearth filled the room. Then Then finally the Samaritan answered softly, "Because one day I may also become the man beside the road." The traveler felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside his chest. Not because the answer sounded dramatic, but because it sounded true, deeply true. For perhaps compassion begins the moment people recognize themselves inside another person's suffering. The innkeeper eventually brought blankets and warm broth, while the Samaritan remained seated nearby. Outside, the roads of Judea disappeared into darkness beneath the stars. Inside the inn, lantern light moved softly across tired faces, while mercy continued its quiet work through the night. And for the first time since the attack, the wounded traveler finally allowed himself to believe he might survive. Most travelers would have left before midnight. The wounded man was safe now. The innkeeper could continue caring for him. The road ahead still waited. Yet the Samaritan remained. While other guests slowly disappeared into quiet rooms upstairs, he stayed seated beside the wounded traveler near the dying fire. The lantern beside them flickered softly against the stone walls, while wind brushed gently against the shutters outside. The traveler drifted in and out of restless sleep. At times, pain pulled him awake suddenly. At times, fear returned before memory fully settled. And each time he opened his eyes, the Samaritan was still there. Not speaking much, not demanding gratitude, simply remaining present. There is a particular comfort found in realizing another human being has chosen not to abandon you. Even silence begins feeling warmer. The traveler watched the Samaritan quietly for several moments. "You should rest too," he whispered weakly. The Samaritan smiled faintly. "I will later." But later never truly came. Each time the traveler stirred in pain, the Samaritan rose immediately. Each time fresh water was needed, he brought it quietly. Each time the bandages loosened, he adjusted them carefully beneath the lantern light. Hours passed slowly. Outside, the roads surrounding Jericho rested beneath deep silence while stars filled the heavens above Judea. Inside the inn, compassion continued working quietly through small acts no crowd would ever witness. And perhaps that is where true mercy becomes most beautiful. Not in dramatic moments seen by many people, but in exhausted acts of kindness performed when nobody else is watching. At one point during the night, the traveler finally asked, "What is your name?" The Samaritan looked toward the fire for a moment before answering softly, "Samuel." The traveler repeated the name quietly to himself. Then, after a long silence, he said something he never expected to say. "I was taught not to trust your people." The words felt uncomfortable immediately. But the Samaritan did not react with anger, only sadness. "Yes," he answered quietly, "and many among my people were taught the same about yours." The fire crackled softly between them. The traveler lowered his eyes. "How strange," he whispered eventually. "The men who shared my faith passed me by, and the man I was taught to distrust stayed beside me." Samuel remained silent for several moments. Then finally he spoke. "Pain reveals who people truly are." The traveler stared quietly into the firelight, and somewhere inside him, old walls built from pride, division, and assumption slowly began breaking apart. Because suffering often strips human beings down to deeper truths. And one of those truths is this: mercy matters more than identity. Compassion matters more than pride. and kindness offered during moments of helplessness can heal wounds far deeper than the body alone. Eventually, the traveler drifted into deeper sleep. Samuel remained awake beside the fire, watching quietly, listening to the slow breathing of the wounded stranger he had carried from the road. The night grew colder outside, yet inside the small inn beside the Jericho road, warmth remained alive. Not only from the fire, but from the simple decision of one human soul refusing to walk away from another. Morning light slowly entered the inn through narrow windows, while the first sounds of movement awakened the streets outside. Merchants prepared carts. Animals stirred within nearby courtyards. Voices echoed faintly through Jericho as another day began. The wounded traveler awoke slowly beneath warm blankets. For several moments, confusion blurred his thoughts again. Then memory returned. The road, the thieves, the loneliness, the Samaritan. Samuel sat nearby, speaking quietly with the innkeeper, while sunlight moved softly across the stone floor. The traveler listened carefully. "Continue changing the bandages twice each day," Samuel said. "He still has weakness from blood loss." The innkeeper nodded. Then Samuel reached into a small leather pouch and placed silver coins carefully upon the wooden table. The traveler watched silently. "These should cover his stay," Samuel continued. "And if recovery costs more, I will repay you when I return." The innkeeper looked surprised. "It may become expensive," he warned carefully. Samuel simply nodded. "Then let it become expensive." The traveler felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside his chest again, because he realized the Samaritan's compassion had not ended once the immediate danger passed. He continued giving. Time, energy, money, attention. And perhaps that is why genuine mercy feels so powerful. Because real compassion always costs something. Many people enjoy appearing kind when kindness requires little sacrifice. But mercy becomes far rarer once helping another person begins demanding discomfort, patience, or loss. Samuel gathered his belongings quietly. The traveler struggled weakly into a sitting position. "You have already done enough," he whispered. Samuel turned toward him calmly. "No," he answered softly. "I have only done what another human being should do." The sentence settled deeply into the silence between them. Not what a holy man should do. Not what a Samaritan should do. Not what a righteous person should do. What a human being should do. The traveler suddenly realized how far society itself had drifted from something simple and sacred. People debated religion, status, purity, identity. Yet meanwhile, suffering human beings remained beside the road waiting for compassion. Samuel approached the traveler slowly. "You will recover," he said gently. "But rest now. Your body still needs time." The traveler looked at him quietly. "How will I repay you?" A faint smile appeared across Samuel's tired face. "Perhaps one day," he answered softly, "you will stop for someone else." Then he stepped toward the doorway. Morning sunlight surrounded him briefly, while wind moved softly through the streets outside. And for a moment, the traveler understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes God sends mercy into the world, not through powerful men, but through ordinary people willing to love others despite fear, inconvenience, and division. Samuel disappeared slowly into the waking streets of Jericho. The traveler watched him go until the sunlight swallowed him completely among the crowds. And though the road between Jerusalem and Jericho still remained dangerous, something within the wounded man had already changed forever. Recovery came slowly. For several days, the traveler remained inside the small inn near Jericho, while his wounds gradually healed beneath careful bandages and quiet rest. Some mornings he woke before sunrise, listening to distant sounds drifting through the streets outside. Merchants preparing their stalls, animals moving through narrow roads, voices greeting one another beneath the warm desert dawn. Life continued moving forward. Yet inside himself, something had changed permanently. The traveler often found his thoughts returning to the road. The loneliness, the fear, the feeling of lying abandoned beneath the cold evening sky while strangers passed without helping. And then, Samuel, the stranger who stopped. The stranger who carried him through the darkness when everyone else chose safety instead. The traveler still struggled to understand it fully. One afternoon, while warm sunlight entered softly through the inn windows, the innkeeper sat beside him quietly. "You have been thinking constantly," the old man observed gently. The traveler smiled faintly. "Yes." The innkeeper nodded knowingly. Pain changes people. For a long moment, silence rested peacefully between them. Then the traveler finally asked, "Do many people stop for strangers along that road?" The innkeeper looked toward the doorway thoughtfully. "Very few," he answered honestly. The traveler lowered his eyes. He already knew the answer. The innkeeper continued speaking quietly while arranging fresh cloth for the bandages. "Most people are afraid. Others are too distracted. Some convince themselves suffering is not their responsibility." The traveler listened silently. Then after a long pause, he whispered, "I think I might have walked past him too." The confession surprised even himself. Yet once spoken aloud, it felt painfully true. Had he encountered a wounded Samaritan beside the road weeks earlier, would he have stopped? Or would fear, prejudice, and convenience have controlled him just as they controlled the others? The realization unsettled him deeply, because suffering had forced him to confront something uncomfortable within himself. It is easy to believe we are compassionate people, until compassion becomes inconvenient. The traveler stared quietly through the window toward the busy streets of Jericho. Everywhere he looked, people hurried past one another, carrying burdens unseen by strangers around them. Some appeared angry, some exhausted, some lonely despite standing among crowds. And suddenly the traveler realized how many wounded souls existed beyond the roads themselves. Not only physically wounded, emotionally wounded, spiritually wounded, quietly broken beneath ordinary life. The realization changed the way he saw the world forever. That evening, after the innkeeper finished changing the bandages, the traveler whispered softly, "When I am strong enough to leave, I do not want to become the same man who began that journey." The innkeeper looked at him carefully, then slowly smiled. "Perhaps," he answered quietly, "that is the deeper healing beginning inside you now." Outside, sunset slowly covered Jericho in warm golden light, while wind moved gently through the palm trees surrounding the city. And within the small inn beside the ancient road, a wounded man slowly began becoming someone new. Far from Jericho, the priest continued his duties within Jerusalem. dressed in sacred garments, still recited prayers, still fulfilled responsibilities before crowds who respected him. Yet inwardly, peace had become difficult to find. At unexpected moments, the image returned. A wounded man beside the road, dust covering his face, weak eyes silently begging for help. The priest tried explaining his decision repeatedly. The road was dangerous. The thieves could have remained nearby. Temple responsibilities were important. And yet, none of the explanations fully silenced the discomfort growing inside him. Because deep within his conscience, another truth remained alive. He had recognized suffering and chosen not to interrupt his own life. Meanwhile, the Levite struggled similarly. Though he spoke little about it outwardly, the memory followed him constantly. Especially at night, he remembered slowing beside the traveler, remembered almost helping, remembered the moment fear became stronger than compassion. Almost. The word haunted him, almost merciful, almost courageous, almost willing to stop, yet not fully. And perhaps many human beings carry the weight of almost throughout their lives, almost becoming who they were meant to become, almost loving deeply, almost helping someone who needed them. But fear often interrupts transformation before it fully begins. One evening, the Levite found himself walking once again near the same Jericho road. The sun lowered slowly across the hills, while cold wind moved through the valleys exactly as it had the night he passed the wounded traveler. The memory returned immediately. This time, however, he stopped walking. For a long while, he stood silently beside the road, staring at the empty stones where the wounded man once lay. And deep within himself, he understood something painful. The road had not revealed the wounded traveler's condition alone. It had revealed his own. Because moments of suffering often uncover truths hidden inside every human soul. Compassion, fear, cowardice, mercy, selfishness. The road between Jerusalem and Jericho had exposed them all. The Levite lowered his eyes quietly, then whispered a prayer carried softly into the evening wind. Lord, teach me not to walk away again. The valleys remained silent around him, yet somewhere deep inside his soul, something had finally begun changing too. The story of the wounded traveler slowly spread through the roads surrounding Jerusalem and Jericho. Merchants spoke about it beside market stalls. Travelers repeated fragments of the story beside evening fires. Pilgrims discussed it quietly while resting during long journeys across Judea. Some focused on the violence. Others spoke about the Samaritan. But beneath every conversation, one deeper question slowly moved through the hearts of those listening. Who truly became a neighbor? The answer appeared simple. Not the priest, not the Levite, the stranger, the man willing to interrupt his own journey for someone suffering beside the road. Yet though the answer sounded obvious, living it remained far more difficult. Because compassion asks something costly from human beings. Time, attention, patience, emotional openness. And many people spend their entire lives protecting themselves from those very things. The wounded traveler thought about this often during the final days of his recovery, especially at night, when the inn became quiet and lantern light flickered softly against the stone walls. His thoughts returned to the road once again. He remembered the fear of being abandoned, the relentlessness. The cold realization that people could see suffering clearly and still continue walking. And then he remembered something else. The moment Samuel stopped. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply, humanly. The traveler realized compassion rarely announces itself loudly. Often it appears quietly. A person remaining beside someone who feels alone. A hand helping another person stand again. A stranger deciding someone else's pain matters. Perhaps mercy changes the world less through grand acts, and more through small interruptions of indifference. One evening, the traveler walked slowly outside the inn for the first time since the attack. His body still ached. His movements remained careful, yet the cool evening air felt beautiful against his skin. Jericho glowed warmly beneath lantern light, while voices echoed softly through crowded streets. Children laughed nearby. Merchants prepared evening meals. Palm trees moved gently beneath the wind. Life continued. But the traveler no longer saw people the same way. Now, whenever he passed someone carrying sadness in their eyes, someone sitting alone, someone exhausted beneath invisible burdens, he noticed, truly noticed, because suffering had changed the speed of his heart. And perhaps that is one of compassion's deepest gifts. It teaches people how to see one another again. The traveler looked upward toward the darkening heavens above Judea, then quietly whispered into the evening air, "Lord, do not let me become someone who walks away." The wind moved softly through the city around him, and somewhere deep inside himself, the wounded man understood the story had never truly been only about the Samaritan. It was about every human soul, choosing what kind of person it wishes to become upon the road. The roads look different now. Cities have become larger, voices louder, lives faster. Yet human beings remain remarkably similar to those who once walked between Jerusalem and Jericho. There are still wounded souls beside the roads of modern life. Not always physically wounded, emotionally wounded, spiritually exhausted, quietly overwhelmed by loneliness, grief, fear, rejection, or despair. Many people smile while suffering silently. Many continue moving through crowded places carrying invisible pain nobody notices. And perhaps the modern world has become especially dangerous in one quiet way. People have learned how to look past one another very quickly. Everyone is busy, distracted, overwhelmed. People scroll endlessly through images and voices while slowly losing the ability to truly see the human beings beside them. And because of this, loneliness grows everywhere. There are people surrounded by crowds who still feel abandoned. People speaking daily with others while secretly believing nobody truly understands them. People lying awake at night, emotionally exhausted while the rest of the world continues moving without noticing. They are still there, beside the road, waiting for compassion, waiting for presence, waiting for someone willing to stop long enough to care. Perhaps that is why the story of the Samaritan continues feeling so powerful thousands of years later. Because every generation creates new roads, and every generation faces the same choice. Will we protect our comfort, or allow another person's suffering to interrupt us? Mercy rarely feels efficient. It slows people down, requires patience, requires emotional vulnerability, requires listening carefully when life demands speed. And many avoid it for exactly those reasons. Yet perhaps the deepest human moments are found precisely there, inside inside interruption, inside presence, inside choosing compassion despite inconvenience. The Samaritan did not heal every wounded person in Judea. He simply refused to walk past one suffering soul. And perhaps that is how goodness always survives within the world. Quietly, personally, one person at a time. The traveler eventually returned home to Jerusalem. Yet long after his wounds healed, the memory remained alive inside him. The cold road, the fading hope, the footsteps walking away, the stranger who stopped. And from that day forward, every time he encountered another person carrying visible or invisible pain, he remembered what it felt like to lie beside the road alone. Perhaps that memory became its own form of mercy, because people who have suffered deeply often become more capable of recognizing suffering in others. The night slowly deepened above Judea, while wind moved softly through the hills surrounding Jerusalem. And somewhere beneath those ancient stars, countless human souls still searched quietly for compassion strong enough to notice them. And so the story ends, not with violence, but with reflection. A wounded traveler lay beside the road. Two men passed by. One stranger stopped. And through those simple moments, the story reveals something profound about the human heart. Every day, people encounter opportunities for compassion. Some notice suffering and continue walking. Some hesitate but choose comfort instead of mercy. And some allow another person's pain to interrupt their own journey completely. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth hidden inside the story is this: at different moments in life, every human being becomes each of these people. Sometimes we are the wounded traveler, lonely, exhausted, quietly hoping someone will notice our pain. Sometimes we become the priest or the Levite, busy, distracted, emotionally distant, protecting ourselves from inconvenience. And sometimes, if compassion becomes stronger than fear, we become the Samaritan. Not because we are extraordinary, but because we choose not to walk away. The world today remains filled with invisible suffering. There are people emotionally lying beside the roads of modern life, hoping someone might finally stop long enough to care. A lonely friend, an exhausted parent, a grieving stranger, a person silently losing hope while everyone around them remains too distracted to notice. And perhaps this story asks one final question worth carrying gently into the heart. Who have we walked past lately? Who needed kindness, attention, patience, mercy? And what would happen if we finally slowed down enough to truly see them? The roads surrounding Jerusalem eventually grew quiet once again. Lanterns dimmed behind stone windows. Marketplaces emptied. Wind moved softly through the sleeping hills of Judea. Yet somewhere beneath the stars, the deeper truth of the story remained alive. Compassion is rarely convenient, but perhaps it is one of the closest things to the heart of God that human beings will ever experience. Perhaps mercy begins the moment people stop asking, "Who deserves my compassion?" and instead begin asking, "How can I love the person beside me?" The traveler never forgot the Samaritan, not because the stranger performed something powerful before crowds, but because during the darkest moment of his life, someone chose to stay. And perhaps many souls listening tonight understand how deeply life can change through one moment of unexpected kindness. person listening carefully. One person refusing to abandon you. One person reminding you that your suffering matters. The stars stretched endlessly above Judea, while silence rested peacefully across the ancient roads below. And somewhere within that silence, another quiet truth remained alive. Every road eventually gives people opportunities to become either those who pass by or those who stop. And perhaps the soul grows closest to God the moment it chooses mercy over comfort, love over fear, and compassion over indifference. If this story brought peace to your heart tonight, you can continue your rest with another peaceful biblical story from our playlist. Subscribe and return whenever your soul needs stillness. Together, we can make this place grow into a quiet sanctuary for many restless hearts.